So welcome to Essential Ingredients. I am your host, Justine Reichman, and today I'm very pleased to welcome Max Bade, founder of Nucleus Capital. Welcome, Max.
Justine, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. I'm really excited about having you on here and learning a bit more about Nucleus Capital and learning about, your journey there, but equally some of the companies that you have coming through there and what is happening in food and specifically some of the innovations you're seeing come through the pipeline. So Max, tell me a little bit about how you got involved and how you got started with Nucleus Capital.
Yeah, that has been actually quite a journey. So, there's a long version and there's a short version. So I'm going to stick to the short version, but maybe to start out in the very early days. So I actually had, the spark of startups, and the passion that comes with that was originally, found in my very first internship, or probably my second internship back in the day. So this has been, a very fundamental moment for myself, where I interned in a venture fund and I learned about companies and the innovation that they were doing. And ever since, I kind of have set my mind on, sticking around, so to speak, and then eventually worked my way up through several stations, be it having founded my own company for a brief time, that miserably failed, some great lessons learned there, to joining other venture funds at more mature stages in my career, and then eventually also helping set up a company from day one as the first employee. And so I've always been in the ecosystem for the last 8 years, both on the operation side as well as the venture side. And then the last 3 years I spent at a local seed fund here in Berlin called Atlantic Food Labs, which essentially also got me very intrigued in the whole food tech scene, and then started thinking about venturing out on myself on my own, and using all that entrepreneurial drive and energy to move something.
So it's interesting because you talk about your first internship and the role that it plays in what you do today. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that. Maybe you can just share with us, what was your first or your second internship?
Yeah, so this was actually a venture capital internship at a very newly established firm back in Munich. Essentially, they were a startup themselves, so very similar to what I'm doing right now. And I currently also have an intern whom I think this will be a great experience too as well. And I hope certainly that it might shape that particular person's career trajectory as well. Just back then, it was very evident that for a millennial like myself, working in an industry that seems to have a lot of impact, both in nowadays also the environmental sectors, but essentially like developing technology that touches everyday's life, and just being part of that and feeling that energy in the room with founders when they have when they demonstrate that intrinsic passion for a certain problem that they're trying to solve. And so that really kind of ignited the spark. And I was lucky enough to be at a fund where there were very few processes in place, very low hierarchy. So I was part of all the meetings and got to shadow the partners, and that really helped.
Was there a specific moment or time or event while you were at this internship when you realized that this was what you wanted to do for the foreseeable future?
I don't necessarily think there was one particular instant. It really just developed over time. And so back then we were looking at a company called HelloFresh, which turned out to be one of the first unicorns in Germany. The fund passed on it because the valuation was too high. That's certainly something that, in hindsight, some people might regret, but that's just part of being in the industry, and like everybody, has this kind of story to tell. But back then, it was a food company, so it was first touch point with food as well. I just thought the concept was really smart. I tested the products myself. I figured, hey, this is actually something that people want, and it matters. So it matters how you can save food waste with that, how you can make lifestyle more convenient, especially to a target group like myself. And just being around the energy really that comes from these companies, and also the energy that comes from VCs who are dedicated to that and who bring passion to the table, is something that I think always stayed for me and has never changed since. And and then throughout the rest of my journey, kind of being operationally involved, looking at how it feels to build a company from day one, scaling that up, obviously, I don't have the background of being able to say, hey, build a unicorn before or anything. But I think just having been on the side of and having been in the trenches and seeing what it feels like, also from an emotional standpoint, to believe in something and then try to make it happen as a reality is just something very beautiful. And I think that's something that people in a corporate job, for example, would really kind of lack, at least. I mean, I'm being very naive here because I've never been on the corporate side. So yeah, maybe that's something for a later point in my life, but I honestly don't think so that I will ever make that move.
Right. And so when you first went into this industry, was it all about food for you, or was it not industry specific?
So as I mentioned, I had my first touch point with Foodtech in 2012. I had another one in 2014 when we set up one of the first vertically integrated online restaurants back in the day for Rocket Internet in London. So I think that the food story has always been there. I myself would consider, me being a foodie, so I love to eat. And the most important part, I think, is that investing in food technology actually leaves you with a tangible physical product most of the times. And users, consumers and customers, and sometimes users, yes, you can definitely call them that. They have an emotional association with that, and this is something that's beautiful because people, when they eat it reminds them of the previous situations that they might have had, of great moments and so on and so forth. And I think that's the key difference that interests me when investing in food is, hey, you have an emotional association with a particular kind of food versus you invest in a purely tech productivity app. So who has an emotional association with Slack? I mean, it's a great company, I use it myself. So but just to make that example and to make that point, right?
Yes, I have frustration. I have an emotional frustration with Slack sometimes.
So I mean, thinking about it even goes a bit further than that for me, because it's a lot of intellectual curiosity around the ways we now have, or the means and the ways we can now influence the future of food, as in with biology, especially synthetic biology, we can now create new kinds of foods, develop something that has never been there before, and while doing so, we also have a very positive impact on the planet, because we can restructure how the value chain works, and we can restructure how production systems work. So in the future, I highly doubt that we will, still use animal agriculture as a main way to satisfy our protein demand, right? So this will, in 10 years or maybe in 8 to 10 years time, and VCs, I think, are always terribly bad at making predictions, although it might seem as though that was part of our job. But I still think that most people heavily underestimate the way technology grows exponentially. So I think maybe in 8 years time, we will see the first cultivated meat product. So meat really grown in a lab, which seems a bit odd to some people. And there's certainly a communications issue around that, because we need to break that negative stigma or the negative connotation that might carry. But I think looking at it as a production method, growing meat from cells in a lab is so much more efficient on every dimension than actually, traditional animal agriculture. And so looking at that, it's both fascination for the end product and appreciation for the end product, but also intellectual curiosity as to how does that work, and what drives the underlying technologies.
Yeah, I mean, we're only just beginning to see some of these things, and they've been in the process right now for years, some of them, right? Lab grown meats, and we've seen some more in Singapore, and we're starting to see and hear a bit more about this now. And
it's important that politics and the regulatory environment starts taking these things serious, because I think with these kind of industries, it only works if it's a three-way equation, right? It's the technology and the company building part, it's the regulatory part, and it's the consumer part. And I think the regulatory part is obviously one where there might be a little bit more of a slower adoption. Mm-hmm. But as you rightfully said, so with the advances that states in Asia already did and Singapore did, I think it's the first important step. The question is, will the other follow? And if they don't, what happens with countries who, are slow on that? Will they be left out in terms of technological innovation, which is something that I could see actually happening in Europe, right? Because the awareness there. And I mean, in general, digitization and, you know, the whole startup industry in Europe is, from a regulatory standpoint, still, it feels like we're in the 19th century.
Yeah. So, you know, with all that being said, what do you think the greatest challenges are as an investor when you see these companies coming through?
That's actually a very good question. So purely from an investor's perspective, I think, one, it is of course incredibly important to be able to filter through the, you know, obviously bad companies, meaning you do need some aptitude for technical feasibility and at least a network of experts where you can, you know, have, because it's not like you're investing in a software model that has been around for ages, right? So B2B SaaS is something which you can benchmark quite easily, where you have investors looking at, you know, comparing certain KPIs and then, you know, drawing up on that and developing a good picture. With Nucleus, or especially for myself, investing pre-seed, so really trying to be at the nucleus of a founder's journey, essentially means that you have to build up conviction super fast, and you need to be able to skim through the technological feasibility. And I think this is something that, you know, we can bring to the table, and it's super important in the beginning, because obviously you don't want to end up with a tech that eventually really doesn't work or is a complete scam. And I think, I mean, there was a story of Juicerio. I'm not sure if you remember that. Super hyped Silicon Valley startup that developed a machine where they can actually press organic juices. Juicero, yeah, exactly. Yes. So turns out, you know, you can just use it with your hands and you can just press it. You don't need a machine for it. And I think it raised hundreds of millions of venture funding, and then eventually it's just a scam, right? So this is a very predominant example. This doesn't happen most of the time, right? So this is really out there, but nevertheless, I think, yeah, looking at that and then also understanding the different layers that technologies move in and essentially what drives them. So it's a combination of many things.
Right. So, and you talk about the nucleus and you talk about pre-seed. So I'd love for our viewers and our listeners to just know a little bit more about how Nucleus works and, you know, your process for investing in that way, and how a company might come to you and, you know, approach you, and how your process works.
You know, as an emerging fund manager, or like first timer, or you know, it's a similar way as a first time founder, first time fund manager. So I'm a startup, or Nucleus is a startup in and of itself as well, right? And so with that in mind, I really try to be as approachable as possible, right? So I answer all my LinkedIn messages. You know, I always get back. It might be 2 days late, but you know, I'll do it. So I'm not at the point yet in my career where I can just brush these things off. So in terms of reaching me, it's really easy. Just write me a message on LinkedIn and maybe wait a day, and then hopefully I'll get back. But in terms of operating, so you know, with Nucleus, we really have that idea of building a better product for founders, which is something that happens, you know, every now and then in venture. There's at every stage, firms reevaluate their positioning. So Tiger Global being one of them at the moment at the later stages, you know, as a hedge fund coming in and simply, you know, overpaying on valuation and being super fast, which turns out to be a better product for founders. And so similar to maybe their approach, I think one of the big advantages of being very small and agile team is that we can make decisions incredibly fast, right? So if I meet a team today and I really love it, I'll dig in over the weekend and I give them an answer on Monday. And I think that's something that doesn't happen if you have long ways of, you know, getting to a decision and kind of talking it through with several partners. So this is obviously one dimension that, you know, really works out. And then the second dimension is being incredibly sector focused. So, you know, I'm not a generalist. I only invest in synthetic biology with applications in food, with applications in material. And, you know, I also invest in generally in climate positive companies. And there's a bit broader there, but nevertheless, those are nascent and narrow markets. And I think the combination of knowing, you know, having a thesis and being fast, and at the end of the day, having a network and or a very close relationship to people who are capable of, you know, evaluating the technologies very, very distinctively and very, you know, build up conviction through that is somewhat of a secret sauce where I think you build up a better product for founders, because, you know, not only do the founders understand that we understand what they're talking about, but they also realize that we are also able to help them, right? Because through the community that I've built with Nucleus, we do have experience of scaling these technologies, going through the typical challenges that are associated with that. And I think this is a powerful cocktail if you mix it with the fact that we only invest very small ticket sizes, right? So typically $200,000 as a pre-seed check, which, is still angel territory. And, it gives the founder the freedom to say, hey, we want Nucleus, but we also want that great VC who's facing downward pressure from the Series A investors.
Essential Ingredients is powered by NextGen Chef. NextGen Chef is a movement that supports food and beverage entrepreneurs around the world by fostering a sense of community and providing its members access to mentors and a wealth of resources and guidance. NextGen Chef feeds members with the knowledge they need to build better for you food and beverage businesses so the world can have greater access to healthier food, comprehensive food education, and increased affordability. If you like what you hear on this podcast, continue the conversation or ask new questions on the NextGen Chef app, available in the Apple Store and Google Play. Follow NextGen Chef on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook at NextGen Chef. Join NextGen Chef and let's change the future of the food industry together.
Can you give us an example maybe of what a company could expect from you?
Yeah, but for sure. So I think there's a very interesting real life example right now going on. I think I'm not sure if you spoke to the founders already, but there's my portfolio company Coa, which is replacing the cocoa bean in chocolate, right? Yeah. So super lovely founders, siblings. They also have this, developed somewhat of a brand for themselves, being the chocolate siblings. Yeah, exactly. I think it works very well in the US. It's something that sticks in people's minds. But so that's actually a really good example of the kind of value that we bring, and also the way we work with companies, right? So having said that, we invest a small check. We're a co-investor by design, so we're not a lead investor. The expectation should be that we are very helpful, and it's certainly my North Star metric is trying to be 5 times as helpful as my check size is. So that's somewhat of my ratio. And that obviously implies that with Coa, for example, we led the pre-seed round. We helped them really to sharpen the equity story. We helped them, with their Y Combinator application. We offered access to a very wide network of biotech founders who, are a little bit further ahead in their journey, who face similar challenges, who've gone through fundraising with generalist VCs and have seen also those challenges. And then in the end, we really helped them to get the right lead investors and to find the right lead investors, where we thought not only from a pure brand or money standpoint, but also which particular partner in that firm could be a great fit for this couple of founders and who could really help them, right? And so putting this all together, I think we were quite hands-on with working with the company. And then, also ongoing, we chat every day, right? And so I really want to be perceived, and it's not only perceived, but it's that feeling that I want to evoke is, hey, I'm super approachable. You can call me at 2 a.m. in the morning. I'll pick up the phone and I'll discuss the hard stuff that you have to present the next day to your lead investor, and I give you a dry run before that, because with me it's a little bit less serious, right? So. And I think if you're young and if you're still considered a junior in VC like I am, and if you're just starting out, this is one of the few things that you have an advantage over with more established partners, because you still need to hustle, you still need to make a brand for yourselves. And I think that's it's not as tangible, but it works.
What do you think the chocolate twins would say about their experience?
Well, I think they would say that they're quite content. I mean, at the end of the day, it is also a case by case, right? And I think in this particular instant, it was very clear from the beginning what Nucleus was able to bring to the table. And I always very transparently communicated that. And I think that, the expectations were met. And I think at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, right? You can't overpromise and then underdeliver. So at the end of the day, they knew going in what they were to expect. I think that's exactly what I delivered. Hopefully I over-delivered a bit. And,
that's always the goal, right?
Yeah.
That's the goal. That's the dream.
The goal, for sure. That's the goal.
So as you bring in more and more companies, and and you are innovating in the food space. What's your hope for the future of food in the next 3 to 5 years? What do you hope to see?
So I really hope to see that, I mean, the next 5 years is probably a little bit too short term, but I can answer the question in two ways. So in 10 years, I hope to see that the incremental cost of these enabling technologies has come down to a point where we're not only able to reach price parity with conventional products in the Western world, but also, you know, be able to drive that price point even further down so that we can actually do something good in emerging economies, right? So we have a huge malnutrition, protein deficiency crisis in the rest of the world that, you know, maybe we in Europe or even in the US don't really, I mean, we're not really aware of that on a day-to-day basis. But I think if you look at the possibilities of technology, we might actually be able to get future meat production from, I don't know, mycelium or even plant-based, you know, to a point where we can actually start feeding the world. And I know this sounds a little bit melodramatic, but I think this is what I would love for the you know, not only capitalist reasons to deal with these things to happen. In the next 5 years, I think what is going to happen is we're going to see a lot of second layer companies. And what I mean by this is really focusing on enabling technology, focusing on specific verticals within the value chain of, for example, cultivated meat. Meaning the first generation of companies obviously is end consumer focused and they're trying to build the, you know, first version of the product. The next generation of companies will be more focused on, for example, developing growth media, developing scaffolding, focusing on the downstreaming process and kind of being an expert in a particular part of the value chain. And I think that could be very interesting, right? And then there's the big elephant in the room, and the biggest problem in the industry is scale-up infrastructure, right? So I think most of the companies, or like all of the companies really, are still like a couple of years away from industrial scale production. And the pioneers like the Impossible Foods of this world and the Mosa Meats of this world, they still have to invest a crazy amount of money in building production capacity themselves. I don't think this is going to be the case in the next 5 to 6, 7 years, because incumbents will have understood that the risk associated with these products is quite low and the benefits are actually quite high. So they might open up production capacity. And the other one is that, you know, startups will start to innovate on that model as well. So I have a very big thesis around contract manufacturing 2.0. So actually doing the heavy lifting and building an asset heavy model in the space to create production capacity, because there's so much demand for that. And I think, you know, I'm looking for a team and for founders who actually tackle that, because it's certainly one of the harder ventures to build, right? And historically, hardware has not been venture friendly.
No, not at all. And it actually goes into what I was going to ask you, which is, you know, will you expand your niches as, you know, throughout, you know, as time goes on, right? So right now you have very specific niches. How do you see expanding them as time goes on?
It's a very good question. So I think it's a broader strategic question that I have to answer for the fund, which in all honesty, I really haven't thought through all the way just yet, because for me, it's really taking one step at a time. But I think looking at, you know, the idea of doing one thing very well versus becoming more of a generalist, I think that's essentially the core decision that one has to make. And my thesis is that at this like food tech, synthetic biology intersection, we're still in the very beginning of those markets, and we're still in the very, very beginning of the first couple of, you know, really quantum leaps in technology. And so my thesis is that for the next 10 years at least, there will be enough and plenty of room to just focus on that and continue doing this. And also obviously accumulate the learnings that come from that, right? So if I'd rather want to be an expert than a generalist.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, it's like we can learn, if we're a generalist and we're a jack of all trades and a master of none, right? There's only so much we can do. But having experts in certain different things allows us to really dig in and be able to make a greater impact. And
to help, really. I think that's
really,
the name of the game.
To help. And that's why I bring on experts in different industries, to be able to really enable people to make more informed choices?
Look, I would never
I
consider
clearly don't
myself
have
an
all the
expert.
answers.
Well, I would never consider myself an expert. I just think, if you spend a significant amount of time in a particular field, you
Right.
do become knowledgeable. And then there's still, the question, if you have access to the right experts, I think that's helpful.
Well, that's really what this platform's all about, is just bringing people in that are, experts and have enough information and have done the due diligence and have really sought after information in different niches to be able to share that information so that the people listening and watching can make more informed choices as they continue to innovate and build new innovations in the food space to help change and create greater access.
And I think, you touch up on a very crucial point. 10 years ago, I think it would have been really hard for an entrepreneur. I mean, it's still really hard, right? So never undervalue that. But it would have been even harder for any entrepreneur or even any emerging fund manager to start something themselves, because there was still such high information asymmetries in the market and so little information on the internet, and accessibility is a huge topic. And so podcasts like yours, but also very specifically focused from a content perspective on how do you build a venture fund, how do you build a venture firm, have been very helpful and also inspiring for myself. And I think that's, the question is, manage your own time. Do you have the time and know when to listen to that? So for me, it's taken me a year to find a routine where I can cramp in my podcast in the morning on my commute. It's like the self-learning moment of the day.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's got their moment. I spoke to somebody yesterday who'll be coming on the podcast in the future, and she listens whenever her husband's traveling. It's her time to meditate and listen in the kitchen while she's cooking and chopping vegetables.
I do the same thing actually when I cook. I also listen to podcasts once in a while.
So,
or when I clean.
or when you clean, that's a good time.
Yeah.
It makes the time pass, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
I listen sometimes in the car or when I'm walking the dogs. So we all listen at different times. And, one other question I wanted to ask you is, we have all these listeners, whether they're watching the podcast or they're listening on iTunes. How would somebody get a hold of you?
Yeah, so I mean, very simple. My email is maximilian@nucleus-capital.com. So, it might take a while. Otherwise, just reach out on LinkedIn. That's the easiest way to reach me. And again, I try to be as approachable as possible. And I still, hopefully I'll be able to get back to everybody.
Well, that's what this podcast is all about, making people accessible and making the information accessible so that everyone's got equal access to the information, so that they can hopefully get a little information to make more informed choices. So Max, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And I hope that our listeners got something out of this, and we're here every Tuesday. So Max, thanks for joining us, and thank you to our guests for joining us. And if you haven't downloaded us, we're on iTunes, Spotify, and our videocasts are on YouTube. So
Justine,
see you.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
To find out more about this episode of Essential Ingredients and access show notes, check out Next Gen Chef and choose podcast in the menu bar. If you like this episode, head to iTunes or Next Gen Chef's YouTube channel to subscribe. Learn more about Next Gen Chef, the platform that powers this podcast, by checking out our website, or visit us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Next Gen Chef. You can also check out my Instagram at Justine_Reichman. If you have thoughts about this episode or future episode ideas, leave us a comment at Next Gen Chef's YouTube channel or drop an email at team@nextgenchef.com. Thanks for joining us.